Welcome to another meeting of Utopia. Today we have a very special guest with us, Jay Hertzmark, who is a retired industrial hygienist at the University of Washington, and he is here today to present his stance on the student debt crisis in the United States and what his proposals are for a better future for all student loan borrowers and college graduates in this country. So Jay, can you give yourself a quick introduction to all of the people who are here tuning in with us?
Okay, so as John said, I was an industrial hygienist. I'm retired now. I worked, my longest job was at the University of Washington, but I worked for Scott Paper Company, which was a paper mill up in Everett, and it's no longer there. I worked at Rome Polanc Chemical Company, which is down across from was down across from Boeing Field, but that's no longer there. I think I left a path of destruction behind me because every place I worked went out of business. So, you know, I don't know if the UW only got COVID, so they didn't quite go out of business. They just got decimated. But I worked with unions a lot over the years, which is what got me in trouble. But I'll tell you about my student debt experience. I have 3 degrees and I attended 7 colleges, universities. So I've got experience paying tuition. I'll talk about that later though. But let's go ahead and start. And I wanna, let's see, I can't see my whole screen. Can you guys see the whole screen? I mean,
we can see
or is it cut off?
Yes, we can see the whole screen.
Okay. So college is getting really expensive. So it's, you know, the price is going up for a number of reasons. I'm not going to get into too much about some of the reasons, but I did look at the UW wages yesterday, and I saw that the football coach gets paid $3.5 million a year. He's the highest paid person, and I don't know if football is worth all that much money, but the university seems to think so. And usually it's the people, you know, it's the people who are making a lot of money that decide how much people get paid. And when they feel that they're peers of them, you know, they're more willing to give them money. And when they feel they're more important than the people whose wages they're decided, then they give them less money. So it tends to stretch out the pay, where the high level people get paid a lot and the low level people get paid less. Anyway, one of the big problems is that in my day, so I started college originally in 1972, which was a long time ago. Okay, the schools, the public universities were subsidized by the state legislatures. Okay, I went to the University of Kansas, my first school, and over the years that subsidy has dropped almost every year. 2008, 2009, when there was the big recession, it dropped a lot, but it's been dropping particularly over the last 25 years, as this one says. It's gone. So when I worked at the UW, the legislature kept cutting the funding, and we said that they should stop calling it the University of Washington and call it a University in Washington, because they didn't deserve to own it anymore because they weren't paying anything. You know? So anyway, here's a graph on state funding, and you can see most of the states are cutting their funding. So this is the change from 2008 to 2018. 2008 was when the Great Recession started. Okay, and Alabama is the worst, how unusual. There's a few states that, the blue states down below, have increased their funding, but you can see Washington's down $1,353. So they've cut their funding that much, okay? And I don't know what, if that's per person or per quarter hour or what. I doubt it's per quarter hour, but anyway.
So I think in the title it says, if you go back in the previous slide, it's state spending per student, inflation adjusted. So these are probably spending per student that they're accounting for.
That might be, I don't know if that's per year or for the whole time you're there or what. Doesn't really say, but.
So it's probably annual. And actually something, a point that I wanted to bring up when you were describing the slide was sort of the separation between red states and blue states, and how despite Washington being sort of an exception, there seems to be sort of a political ideological difference when it comes to conservatives and cutting, state funding for higher education. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the conservative ideals for less government intervention, particularly when it comes to the funding of state colleges, that probably has a lot to do with sort of the trend that we're seeing here in this table that we're seeing.
This table, so the red and the blue here is just whether they've increased the funding or decreased the funding. So this is not, the Democrats versus Republicans. But if you looked at just at these states here that have increased the funding, Wyoming, that's usually a pretty conservative state, and North Dakota is usually a pretty conservative state. So it doesn't follow Montana also. So it doesn't really follow too closely what we traditionally call red and blue states, because those, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, those are all, Republican red states. New York is a Democratic blue state. California is a Democratic blue state. Some of the others are kind of in between, but the trend here is that almost all of the states have cut their funding to various levels. Okay, all right, and then here's the increase in tuition, and this is inflation adjusted. So Washington's up 34% since 2000, or between 2008 and 2018, almost 35%. Let me go back here. So here, now Louisiana here, if you see Louisiana is the second from the top one. So they've cut their funding, and then here's Louisiana tuition is, doubled. Anyway.
Okay, so the way that you're framing the two slides together, you're trying to see if there's a cause and effect where a cutback in state funding for tuition is leading to tuition increases in these public colleges and universities. Is that sort of the point that you're trying to drive at?
It's one of the factors. There's a lot of factors that affect how much a university charges. And some of it is, how much funding they get from the state. But if my memory is correct, back in 2008, the UW is only, that's before all the cuts started, before these cuts started happening. I think the most they were funding was like 25%. I think 25% of the UW budget came from the state. So it wasn't a huge chunk. So there were also, there are lots of other funding sources that affect the tuition. And then there's also expenditures, how top heavy is the administration, that kind of thing. How clean do they keep the buildings? It was interesting, one little side light on that. When I started working at the UW in 1991, they had more custodians than they did when I left, which was in 2013, and they built a whole bunch of buildings in the meantime. And cleaning technology has not gotten that much better that they're that much more efficient. Anyway, so maybe that's what kept down the tuition artificially. Anyway, but this slide says, the funding cuts from the state is 79% of tuition increases is responsible for. Okay, so there is definitely a relationship between these two. Don't get dizzy, but between those two slides. Okay.
So actually, if you think about this from a supply and demand standpoint, I don't think it's exclusively the higher education funding that is the main contributor for the tuition increase. I think a lot of it has to do with the increased demand that is driven both from, say, the federal government standpoint, where the opening of credits for student loan borrowers to borrow tens of thousands of dollars to attend these universities, as well as the influx of international students to sort of continue to stimulate and create a market for these universities to get away with tuition hikes. I think that seems to me at least the primary contributors to tuition increase rather than say higher education funding cuts. So I was wondering perhaps if you could elaborate a little bit more on sort of why you believe this argument seems to be the case.
Well, I mean, as I said, there's lots of reasons for tuition to go up that are independent of funding from the state. Okay, and supply and demand can be one of them. And certainly the demand for university education is much higher than when I was young. I mean, when I got my master's degree, I was unusual. And when I started working at the UW, almost everybody I worked with had a master's degree. So it's like, it's now in some jobs, and industrial hygiene is one of them, it's an entry-level job. It's an entry-level degree. You have to have a master's. Okay, so the demand is up. Okay, so you're right about that. But there's a lot of other things that affect tuition. The technology, when you got to replace all the computers every 3 or 4 years. When I was in school, I could take a computer science class, and that would be the only time I ever saw a computer. We just didn't have computers. And so the technology moved a lot slower. And as I said earlier, the salaries, if the administrators start padding their salaries, and there start to be a lot more. I mean, I've read about top-heavy administration, meaning there's a lot of administrators. In my department, when I started, we had office managers. When I left, they were all associate directors or assistant directors. So, and they all got raises for that. It was the same job, but it was padding salaries. So that would raise tuition. So there's a lot of different things. And certainly supply and demand is one of them. So, but it's multifactorial, and I have no idea what they were looking at. I just found an article that said this, and I said, oh, it must be true because it's on the internet. But I don't know what they were measuring and how they measured this thing. Okay. This is a graph of debt, okay, and it compares the student loans, auto loans, and credit cards. And you can see that back in 2000, 2005, in that time, credit card debt and auto loans were about the same. They were running pretty closely together, and student debt was much lower. And zoom, student debt really took off. And autos became much more expensive. Credit card didn't seem to change very much. I would think that there would be some change in there because that's when the Great Recession was, but doesn't seem to have changed very much. I'm surprised credit cards have stayed that much, but anyway, but you can see student loans have really taken off, right? The way my screen's set up, I can't read what it's $32,000 average. I can't read the rest of it, but mortgage debt, which was not on that previous, it's not on this graph. Mortgage debt has always been the biggest debt. And that's because, houses cost, a cheap one is $500,000 now. and student loans aren't quite that much. Credit cards and auto loans, they're pretty even, or pretty close to each other relative to the others, but they seem to be running that way now. Okay. This is the default rate for student loans. Okay, and it's hard to default on student loans. They made it particularly hard, difficult to default because when you first start out, you've got a lot of debt, and if it was as easy to default on, you don't have any assets when you first graduate. You've lived in an apartment, you may have a computer. Some people have an old car, but there's nothing they can go after you for. And if you default, you don't have to pay. They take all your possessions, but you don't have to pay anymore. But so they made it more difficult to default. But still, it's over 10%. That's a pretty high default rate. So black low income Latino students, those folks have much more. They borrow more, and they also drop out of school with more debt. They're because of the debt, and they aren't willing to take on more debt. Folks drop out of school, especially if they feel their job opportunities aren't going to be that good. So they may say, "I'm not borrowing any more money. I'm just going to drop out of school."
Yeah, actually, I was curious when you were sort of getting the information for this particular slide, if you sort of knew the reasons for why the dropout rates for Black and Latinos tend to be higher than, say, Asian students or white students. Is it because of a sort of a financial perspective, where they're sort of no longer able to finance the student debts that they've accumulated, or perhaps could it be more from an ability standpoint, say, affirmative action sort of misplacing these students into institutions where perhaps their surrounding peers are performing at higher levels than they are, and that's sort of disincentivizing them to sort of continue with education. I was wondering if you have any insights, more insights on that.
Well, again, there's many factors that are causing this. One of them would be more likely, or they are more likely to be like the first person in their family to attend college, or to graduate from college, and so there's less peer pressure. I mean, like my parents you're going to college. That's the way my parents always were. I remember one time trying to argue with them that a high school degree was plenty, and they said, "No, you're going to college." And if your parents never went to college, they're not going to argue that way with you. Okay? So and Blacks and Latinos, they didn't, you don't find that many my age that have college degrees, because that opportunity was not there. And their schools, when I was a kid, the schools were more segregated. When I was going to elementary school, there was Jim Crow, which is segregation in the South, legal segregation. And in the North, it was de facto, meaning it really was segregated. I mean, my high school, my junior high school, I went to a couple elementary schools. I remember one Black kid in one of my elementary schools, and none of the other schools had any Black kids. Okay, so, and there was no law then. I grew up in Kansas. Kansas did not have Jim Crow laws, but we were still segregated. And so, and the schools that the Blacks and Latinos, there weren't very many Latinos then either, but the schools that Black students went to, they were not nearly as good as the schools that I went to. Okay, so that makes it harder to go to college. If your school is no good, you don't have the preparation. So I think again, I think there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is if you have more debt. Okay. All right. So here's a couple of little statistics. For every $1,000 increase in student loan, there's a 1 to 2% drop in home ownership. So I used to have a house. I have a condo now. I own it, you know, but you know, if I had a bunch of student loans that I had to pay off first, I wouldn't be able to come up with the money to buy a house. Okay. And let's see, here it says home ownership rate for 24 to 30 something year olds fell 9% between 2005 and 2000 something. 400,000 people could not buy a house. And that's when the loans started really taking off.
So I know that the data sort of paints a sort of gloomy picture, but for students like us who never owned a home before or much of assets in particular, what has home ownership meant for you? Why is home ownership sort of special in the way that perhaps it's something that every individual should aspire to have eventually at some point in their lives?
I don't think that home ownership is for everybody. And I don't think everyone has to aspire to it, but there are some distinct advantages. For example, so I borrowed money to buy a house. Okay, so I had to come up with a down payment. I was able to do that, and I had borrowed the rest of the money. Because of tax incentives, all the interest I paid was tax deductible. Okay, and when I first borrowed bought my house, interest rates were 10.5%. Now there's something like 3 and 4%, I think. But all that interest was tax deductible. If you're paying rent, you don't get to deduct any of that. Also, houses tend to appreciate in value. I bought my house in '88 for $90,000, and I sold it in 2014 for $550,000. That was money in my pocket. Okay, I only had to pay the $90,000 for that house. The rest of it, it was like somebody gave me the money. Okay, so it's generally a good investment. Not like all investments, it's not always, but generally housing is a good investment. Okay, my house is paid off. Since I live in a condo, I still have to pay condo association fees, but that's for maintenance, which, you know, if you own a house, you still have to maintain the thing. But I don't have to pay my monthly rent. You know, I don't have to pay anything. It was a good investment for me. I pay $300 a month, $350 a month. You know, I don't think either one of you guys or any of you guys have rents that's cheap. And it's just because I own my own house. So there's disadvantages to owning a house too, but it's generally a good investment. All right. Okay. All right. This is interesting. Mortgage interest rates are lower for people who don't have student debt because it's a credit rating. The interest rate, what you pay interest on any loan, is based partially on your credit rating. Okay, and if you've already got a lot of debt, then they think, you know, the people who are going to make loans think you're more likely to default, and so they're going to charge you some more. Okay? So the less debt you have, the lower your interest rate is on buying a house. Okay. Let's see. Oh, this is the one on the jobs. Since I didn't have debt looming over me, I didn't have pressure to get a job, any job. Okay, so I was able to hold out for a little while. I mean, you still got to live and everything, but I wasn't desperate to find a job, and so I was able to get a job in something, you know, that I wanted to do, and so I was able to get stuff as an industrial hygienist, I didn't feel pressure to get, when I was having trouble finding an industrial hygiene job, I didn't feel pressure to just take any job. Okay. Oh, retirement savings. Since you got to pay off your debt, you can't put money into retirement. And so, and the money that you're able to put away when you're young because of compound interest is more important than the money you put away when you're older, because it has more time to earn interest. Okay, so if you're paying off your student debt instead of being able to put that money into a retirement account or something, you're at a disadvantage. Okay. Delays in marriage. I'm going to not go over these statistics as much, but people with loans have to tend to delay marriage and having families a little bit more than people who don't have debt. Business creation, if you wanted to start your own business, if you're paying off debt, you may maybe have a hard time trying to get, coming up with money to start your business, because it takes money to earn money, as we say. And also, again, you may be pressured to just find a job so you can start paying off that loan. But business creation is limited by high student loan debts. This is kind of interesting on a day-to-day basis, in that if you have an emergency, your car breaks down, or something your health insurance doesn't cover, or something like that, debtors have less money that they can spend on emergencies, because they're paying to pay off their debt. So if you don't have debt, you have about twice as much, money on hand for emergencies. Brain drain. People tend. So this is a rural brain drain. I don't know if you're familiar with the term brain drain. It's basically the smart people leaving whatever area is being drained. And sometimes countries say they have brain drains, but in this case, it's rural areas. People with debt tend to go to cities where they can earn more money, even though they may want to stay in their rural area that they grew up in. All right, that's the problem. So I've just listed a couple solutions here. One is Biden's, and I heard he gave a speech about it today. So this is not accurate anymore, but this was what he said during the campaign, was that he wanted to forgive up to $10,000 in federal student loans. So if you've got federal student loans, that's different than private loans. He would forgive up to $10,000 for people who earn less than $125,000 a year. Okay. And then he would also say he would forgive loans for students going to either public schools, public universities, or two-year schools, historically Black colleges and universities, and other minority-serving institutions. That's like, there's Indian schools that I'm familiar with. I'm not sure what other minority schools there are, but Biden says he'd be forgiving loans. Okay. So, excuse me. Well, basically, I think he wanted to make these free if you go to 2-year and 4-year schools. Okay. And his website said also said $10,000 of student debt relief every year if you do national or community service. And I don't know how he defined national service or community service. Sometimes websites just kind of leave stuff up in the air. Okay. Elizabeth Warren was kind of famous for for addressing this issue. And I think her proposal kind of pushed Biden to give up, to present his proposal. But Warren said $50,000, canceling up to $50,000, as opposed to Biden's $10,000. Warren would cancel up to $50,000 and then kind of phase out the cancellation between. So this is family income of $100,000 and $250,000. So the top 5% of people would not be eligible for this cancellation. And the canceled debt would not be taxed as income. Also, she said there would be no tuition or fees for 2- and 4-year public schools. And then this would be paid for with this ultra millionaire tax. This is not an income tax. This is a property tax or a wealth tax. So it would be 2% on people who have over $50 million in wealth. And wealth can be anything of value. Okay, so cars and boats and property and expensive jewelry and art and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Just these were a couple interesting things. So these, when I was a kid, okay, I remember that California public colleges were free. So free, there was no tuition. And that was until Ronald Reagan became governor of California. This is before he was president of the United States. He was governor of California, and he started charging, his administration started charging tuition in California. And this other one is the City University of New York. I went there. I got my master's there. And that used to be free. It wasn't free when I went to school there, but that was free. And New York City University was pretty famous for providing a really good education for people poor people, okay? And there were, I can't remember who they were, but I remember at one time reading a list of people who attended City University, and they were really famous, artists and such like that. But they grew up poor, and they just didn't have money, but school was free then. So that was important.
So what exactly was the catalyst? Because you obviously lived during these times, and so you were able to witness firsthand perhaps what the direct events were in order for public colleges to no longer be free but now charged. Was it because the federal government started allowing federal student loans that public colleges no longer became free? Or was it just a matter of we need to start having individuals start paying for the colleges themselves instead of the government? So what exactly was the catalyst during this time?
In Reagan, in California, that was a political thing. It was just a philosophy that we shouldn't have free schools, that people should have to pay for. Okay, there was nothing. I don't know when federal loans became easier to get, but this was Reagan's political stance, that schools should not be free, should have to pay for it. In New York at this time had a bad financial crisis. Okay? And I don't know if you remember hearing about a headline in I forget, it was New York Daily News and New York Post, Ford to New York dropped dead. New York City was having really bad financial, they were in a really bad financial situation at this time in 1976, and they were trying to get federal money, and Ford, who was president then, said no. And so that's when they started charging tuition. And it was a direct result of that. So that I'm sure didn't have anything to do with the federal student loans.
So it had, so was it something related to perhaps the GI Bill for the veterans returning from World War II, or perhaps it was because of the National Defense Education Act, I believe, in 1958, that sort of served as the precedent for we need to start having more of our younger people start attending these universities and perhaps we need to provide support for them to be able to do so. Do you think perhaps that played a role in sort of, public colleges to no longer be free?
Well, these two things, these two schools, they started charging a long time after both of those situations. So I don't think that was related. I can't tell you what effect those two, the GI Bill and what was the other one called? The Federal Defense?
National Defense. It was in response to, I believe, Soviet Union launching Sputnik 1. And
Yeah.
so we were in the space arms race during that time.
So when was Sputnik 1? That was in the 50s or the early 60s?
I believe if it was passed in 1958, it was probably a bit before that. So probably in the 1950s,
Okay,
the launch probably occurred.
I mean, these two things were a lot later. I mean,
Right.
So I don't think that those were related.
I have something to add. I think the longer trend was that college was unattractive for a lot of people for the longest time. They really, a lot of European higher education really started as seminaries where people wanted to devote time to do a deep religious study. And it really wasn't applicable to the practical world until later. And during those times, I would imagine the funding for these seminaries are probably donations, because of course, you might be able to work and attend these early colleges at the same time, but they probably receive some donations for people of faith. And, as college became more practical, people were able to charge for it. I think those are some longer term trends.
So are you talking about like a Renaissance era European universities, or I mean, because that's when they were really totally associated with the religion, with the churches and such.
Yes, that and very early American universities.
Okay. Yeah, so they were affiliated with churches. I think in the late 1800s, I'm not sure, but science wasn't very strong, or I don't know. Never mind. I can't answer that. How's that? Okay. That was all the history I wanted to talk about. I thought these two things were interesting. Back to Biden and Warren's proposals. Neither one of them addressed living expenses, and living expenses are going up much faster than wages. And even though your school's free, you may not have time or much time to work, and you still have living expenses. And so they didn't address that, and that's going to make a big difference, I think, for people whose family can't provide them. Like my parents loaned me money, or they gave me money to go to college the first time, but they paid my living expenses. If I was on my own and I was going to school full time and had to have a job to pay for living expenses, that's difficult. I did work some, but not very much. But this doesn't, neither the Biden nor the Warren proposals talk about living expenses.
Oh, so actually I heard from a couple of people from the older generations that, we sort of worked our way through college. How exactly true is that statement? Because just as you mentioned earlier, that may or may not necessarily have been an option for everybody. And for you especially, you needed the support of your parents to be able to get through college. So what exactly was the financial situation for people to be able to afford college during your times?
Well, tuition was lower then. So, in real money, tuition was a lot lower than it is now. Okay, so taking inflation into account, it was a lot less. Some people, you could go to school part-time. I mean, that's an option. So there were, I mean, I've read a lot about people who went to school part-time and worked during, you know, they worked still, and they went, and in fact, that's how I got my master's degree. I worked full-time and I went to school part-time. A lot of programs don't allow you to do that. And I know, so I did industrial hygiene at City University. The UW has an industrial hygiene program, and you can't go part-time. They won't let you. I don't know why, but they won't. Okay, so I also, you know, I was a nurse. So my second degree was in nursing, and I was working in an emergency room, and I had a good paying job. And I will also, so I had a good paying job. The hospital paid for my books. I had a federal grant that paid for my tuition, and I went to school part-time. So I think I was probably the wealthiest grad student I ever knew. I did okay then, but I've read a lot about people who like would go to school, and especially in New York, I remember there were lots of night schools, and people could go to school at night and work in their regular job during the day. But it's hard to work a lot when you're going to school, especially if you're going to school full time. But some people did it, and some people also don't require a lot of sleep, so they're able to work more. There's some people aren't as lazy as I am, and we're unwilling to spend that much time working on, doing work and going to school. There's lots of reasons lots of ways to do it. But the main one is that, well, the wages were higher relative to the tuition. So, and living expenses are a lot more than they are now. I mean, now they're more expensive. As I said earlier, that living expenses go up faster than wages. So that means that in the old days, people's wages covered more. So that would be another reason.
So was it ever the case that college was sort of perceived to be something exclusive to the few, the wealthy and the elites who could sort of afford to attend college? Because judging from what I've heard from you, it seems like there were a lot of flexibility and different approaches that people took in order to be able to afford and to attend college. Given the fact that back in the days, perhaps the number of schools wasn't as plentiful as before, and the admissions rate was probably more competitive, perhaps, was school ever something perceived to be just for the elites, or were people able to sort of be able to afford it, including everyday, ordinary Americans?
Well, not nearly as many people went to college, in the old days. We'll say the old days, whenever those were. I mean, it's just every year more and more people are going to college. When I graduated from college, it wasn't, I don't know what percentage of people went to college then, but I know a lot fewer people did then than they do now. Again, as I mentioned, the entry level education is higher now than for a lot of jobs than it used to be. And so, and it was a lot wider. There weren't as many Asians and Hispanics in the United States when I was going to college. And there were, I think African Americans were a higher percentage than they are now of the population, but there weren't very many in colleges and universities. But yeah, I mean, it was more elite than it is now.
Yeah, because sort of the reason why I brought it up is it seems like it's the basis for the reasoning why the federal government sort of enacted student loan programs in the first place to allow all Americans, including those in the middle class and the lower class, to have access to affordable upper education, which sort of no longer seems to be the case today. But that seems to have been the original intent for federal student loans to have existed in the first place, is because of sort of this basis that education, college education, should be for everybody, not just for the few.
Well, at one time, if you said defense, they'd throw money at it. So that's why you mentioned the National Defense Student Loan Program. I had a National Defense Nursing Loan. It's like, I didn't have anything to do with defense. I never worked in a military hospital or anything like that. But I had a National Defense Student Loan. And at one time, it's you put the word defense in it and you can spend whatever you wanted to. They'll give you money. Okay. And I think some of what you're talking about, the space race with the Russians or with the Soviets at that time, Sputnik and such, that's because we were afraid that our education was not, especially our science education, was not as good as the Soviets were. And so they threw money at it. I don't think that had anything to do with equality or equity. Because one thing was, it was before the civil rights laws. That was during the Jim Crow period, when Blacks and Jews and Hispanics and Asians were forbidden from doing a lot of stuff. And that didn't really go away to any extent until the late 60s. And those loans you're talking about, they occurred in the early 60s or 50s. I think during the Eisenhower administration was a lot of that, which was ended in 1960. So I don't know if that addresses what you're.
No, it makes more sense now, because I feel so naive for trying to come off from a more moral standpoint, when in fact you're probably right, when it's probably like a defense perspective, where it was for the defense of the country that the United States decided to make this move, rather than for more of the humanistic side of the argument, which some politicians try to argue for today, but probably wasn't the case back then.
Yeah, when I was a kid, so by kid I mean grade school. So grade school, there was there was some, but in general, if you're Black, stay back. No Asians or dogs in this restaurant or this store. Those were signs. No sticks or wops. These are signs in stores. And that's the way things were. And yeah, I don't think those loans, those ones that have defense written on them, were anything to provide equity. They may have continued funding them because they provided equity. And like the GI Bill, so that was right after World War II, that was strictly aimed at whites. Okay, the GI Bill allowed housing. You couldn't get that. You couldn't get housing loans if you were a Black soldier. They still wouldn't give them to you. And you couldn't buy houses because, except, the Central District. I don't know if you're familiar with the Central District in Seattle. It was a historically Black area. It was the only area that Blacks could buy houses because they were forbidden from buying them anywhere else. And so that was a Black neighborhood. Now with gentrification, whites have moved in there. When I moved to Seattle, it was mostly, I think it was 75% Black, and now it's less than 50%. It's like 20% Black. But that was the only neighborhood that Blacks could buy houses for a long time. So anyway, shall we go on?
Yes, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I had it good. My parents paid, so I have 3 degrees I mentioned. I have a bachelor's of general studies with no major, which is as useful as it sounds. I went to the University of Kansas. My parents paid for that degree. They just gave me the money to go to school. Okay. Then when I discovered that I should have paid it, I should have worked harder in school and gotten a major and everything, and I wanted to go back and get a nursing degree, they were willing to loan me some money. Okay. I also got, as I said, the National Defense Student Nursing Loan, and I got a scholarship too. The National Defense Student Nursing Loan, that was interesting because I borrowed as much as I could on that. I don't remember how much I borrowed, but it was if you did public service. So if you got a job in either a public hospital, a government agency, so like public hospitals, like Harborview or University of Washington, you got your loan forgiven, 20% the first year, 20% the second year, and 20% the third year. And if you continued to work in public or nonprofits, continued to work in there, then they subtracted another 15% for the next 2 years. And at that time, so I ended up having to pay 10% of my loan off. At that time, the interest did not start accruing until after I had to start paying on it. So this was 5 years after I graduated that the interest started accruing, and it was only at 3%. And at that time, inflation was running 10, 10.5, 12, 14%. And so it was like free money. Even the stuff I had to pay off was like no big deal. So that was a good deal. And again, that was a National Defense Student Nursing Loan. And then my master's, I said, I told you that was in occupational health nursing. It wasn't really industrial hygiene, but it was a nursing degree. But as I said, I had the federal grant that paid that. My tuition in the hospital I worked for paid for my books, and they gave me. This was in New York City, so they subsidized my housing. The hospital did, and it was a good paying job. So I got off. I should have that. I had it good written down in the big letters. I had it good. I had it really good.
Yeah, not gonna lie, if I could trade my position right now with yours, I would do it in a heartbeat.
It's like how many even years ago, grad students subsidized housing, a good paying job, that just didn't happen. Certainly not now. Anyway, and in nursing, it's like I could have gotten a job at any hospital in New York at that time. I could have walked in, started working that day, or maybe the next day. When I moved to Seattle, I came here, I drove here from New Jersey. It took 18 days to drive here. I got offered a job the day I got here. And I said, let me unpack tomorrow, and then I'll start working. So it's like, it was easy to find a job. All right. So let me ask you guys, what's your story?
So before I share mine, Bugard or Edward, do you two want to share your story? Especially Edward, since you've graduated, maybe you can go first. What's your story at right now?
Yeah, sure. I think I was very lucky in how my parents were able to buy a house in the Seattle area. So I didn't need to really worry about living expenses. And also, I think there was a state grant that paid most of my tuition for my 4.5 years at UW. I had to pay tuition for 2 quarters, and that was really expensive. But the state grants didn't just cover the tuition; it also gave me some money for textbooks and living expenses. So I largely got away with only, I think, it was somewhere in the $10,000 of student debt, and then I was able to pay that off with my military service. There was also a really good incentive if you were in the National Guard, you could actually get half off state tuition. I mean, it's a huge obligation as well, but that's also a nice part of being a soldier. And there were veteran benefits on campus that are pretty nice that National Guard soldiers had access to. So right now I'm debt free and just like living with my parents. It's not stressful at all. So I have it pretty good as well.
Edward, you have it really good. So Bugard actually is from Taiwan. So perhaps Bugard, you can share perhaps an international perspective on student loans and what it has been for you to have a student loan in the United States.
Yeah, I was lucky that my parents paid my tuition, but when I first came to the United States, I was surprised by how high the tuition was. Yeah, since in Taiwan, um, the the number is like pretty much the same, but in new Taiwanese dollar rather than the United States dollar. So that is like 1/30th, and the expense level here in the United States is much higher than that in Taiwan. So um, I when I started in UW, there was kind of a lot of pressure because of the financial situation, but I'm still lucky that my parents pay my tuition, so I don't need to worry about money. But yeah, it's just like that knowing that my parents paying a lot of money sending me to college. I there is a lot of pressure, and I'm working hard to find a major, but that is I'm trying to applying for computer science.
Yeah, so I can actually probably speak on the behalf of the portion of the population who do still currently have student loan debt and is going to face the prospects of having to pay for them after graduation. For me, when I first applied to University of Washington, I was very naive. I didn't really know much about how interest rate works. I didn't really understand the differences between all the different federal student loans that was being provided. And so going into University of Washington, me and my parents, and since my parents who are not fluent in English, we sort of went through this process blindly. And so only now we're belatedly learning about the fact that we're going to have a lot of financial difficulties when I graduate. And it's part of the reason why I really wanted to see our legislators doing something about the student loan crisis, but especially for families who perhaps weren't very informed about how student loans worked in the United States. And so the fact that I wasn't even put into a major the first year I came here, but rather put into some sort of general pre-major arts and sciences instead of promising me a major that could actually pay for itself after I graduate, that was a lot of stress and tremendous burden that I'm still even experiencing to this day in terms of how am I ever going to pay back my debts because I'm an out-of-state student and my family, we're first generation immigrants, so we don't even have a lot of money to work with. So what am I going to do? And so that's a worry that I have constantly every single day. And so I think having this discussion really opened my eyes to learn perhaps what are the possible avenues for people like myself to get out of this crisis.
Bogart, are you paying international student rates?
Yeah,
So that's a lot higher than even what John's paying as an out-of-state student.
I'm not sure, but I think out of state and international are pretty neck to neck. They might actually be the same if I'm not mistaken. Bugart, do you happen to know more about it?
they're the same.
Okay, so you don't pay like anything extra for being an international student?
No.
Okay. Yeah, so it definitely feels like universities have just, become a business model where they're sort of financing all of their bureaucratic spending through increasing the number of out-of-state students or international students that they're accepting in order to build up the prestige or the facade of prestige of being a great university and to artificially stimulate uh, sort of application rates into their universities to make themselves look like a better institution without actually raising the quality of their education. But of course, I'm just a student, right? So I might be a little biased about that perspective, but that's how I feel about the situation.
John, there is a silver lining. That is sort of not a silver lining. So we're looking at, probably within the next few years, we're probably going to see a massive inflation bomb as people run away from the dollar. That means the real value of your debt will probably go down.
How is that a
We're trying to
silver
be
lining?
positive.
As much as I would like to say that I would like to be self-centered, I prefer the economy of the United States to be doing better than my financial state. But that's just a selfless thing for me to say. Jay, what are your sort of thoughts or impressions you have from hearing our testimonies? Do you have perhaps advice you want to give us or questions you want to ask?
Well, from what I've read and what you guys are studying, it's a worthwhile investment that you will get paid more because you have a college degree in computer science or economics than you would have, even subtracting the money you have to borrow. You're still ahead. Okay, you're just not nearly as far ahead as I was. I think you guys are getting a shitty deal, and this is certainly not the only thing that younger people are getting the raw end of the stick. No, the short end of the stick on. There's lots of disadvantages. I mean, when I was growing up, it was expected that I would do better than my parents. And that's traditionally my generation did better than our parents. But that's not the situation anymore. Now, if you're an immigrant family, then that's a little bit different. But if I had kids, which thank God I don't, I wouldn't expect them to be as financially secure as I am. I mean, I would be surprised if they were. It's, I don't know why it's like that, but I don't know what the trend is that makes it like that, other than the general separate, the greater extremes between rich and poor, where you have super rich and then everybody else. But we're not spending as much on schools. When I was in grade school, we had to supply papers and pencils and crayons, and everything else was supplied by the school. We didn't have to pay for books, or we didn't have computers, but the school supplied everything for us other than pencils and pens and paper. And when my mom was going to school, I remember when we were buying stuff for me to go to school, my mom said, "Why do you have to pay for this?" When she went to school, the school paid for that, supplied that too. But there's all these expenses now that are not covered in school, and then there's at the university level, there's administration is getting paid so much more than they used to, and there are a lot more administrators. And I will admit that as a safety guy, I was part of the administration. I doubt that the University of Kansas had industrial hygienists working there at the time when I went to school there. I commend you for going to battle to do this battle. And I will also say that a suggestion, and especially because I heard in the news today as I was coming home to do this, that there was some comments on that Biden made about student debt, and you should write your senators and your congressmen. And here in Washington, we've got, I think pretty supportive ones, but I think it's reasonable and a good idea to, and even if you're not a US citizen, you don't have to tell them you're not. Pick whatever district you're in and give them your address, and then they think that you can vote for them. But if you're not old enough, or if you're not a US citizen, it doesn't matter. You can still write to them and you can pretend you are. Just don't tell them you're not. But this is a hot issue now, and I think it's reasonable. I think it would be an advantage to you guys to do that.
Yeah, I totally want to see a day where sort of the crisis will be able to find solutions for not just my current generations, but also the generations that's going to follow after us in regards to whether there's going to be sustainable alternatives to perhaps universities going into the future. And with the time being already 6:15, I just wanted to thank Jay for his wonderful presentation today and for taking the time out of your day to be able to give us such informative content and advice for everything in regards to student loans. So I want to thank Jay as well as everybody else for coming to today's meetings.